Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 8 on campaigns and elections. Today we're going to talk about some of the timely, divisive, and controversial issues in elections and campaigning today. I'll briefly highlight some issues in representation, issues within the campaign finance system. I'll highlight what Citizens United means and whether or not money in politics equates buying power. I'll also explain to you the Electoral College and some issues in voting in terms of voting fraud and voter ID laws. So almost all Democratic and Republican nominees for president have been white, male, rich, and Protestant. Most have had some kind of higher elected office, and for instance, the vice presidency or a seat in the Senate or the governorship. And things are, of course, slowly changing. In 1984, Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro was the first Democratic VP nominee. In 2000, the Democratic Party nominated the first Jewish VP candidate on a major ticket, Joseph Lieberman. And of course, in 2008, we had our first African American nominee and then later president. President Obama, right? And he was competing for the nomination with Hillary Clinton, who was the first serious female candidate for president. Unfortunately, though, these are slow-moving changes. Compared to other countries, the U.S. is 98th in the world for percentage of women in the national legislature, down from 59th in 1998, so we're not doing so well. 5 governors are women, and 24 states have never had a female governor. That's almost half of the states in the entire country. The percentage of women holding state legislative office is less than 25%. And this is all in the reality that women make up over half of the U.S. population. That's over 161 million women. At this rate, we won't have fair representation for 500 years. It's not like equality magically happens just because more women are elected to office. There's still a ton of inequality, right? There's violence against women, there's discrimination on many other fronts, but it's a start. And there is a correlation with better governing and more female legislators, like more progressive policies on issues like the environment, support for families and individuals, and macroeconomic management. Female legislators do introduce more bills on civil rights, civil liberties, education, health, and labor. And, seen in countries around the world, the more women in key national leadership positions, the more there's more correlation with greater increases in GDP economic growth in comparison with countries with just or more male leaders. So the more women you have in leadership positions, there tends to be greater economic growth. And of course, we have to consider also people of color who are also not equally represented. There are proportions of the population that are over and underrepresented in all levels of democracy, right? As we can see here in the overrepresented parts, 90% are white, 90% are white right here. Over 60%, I think that's actually 70%, are men. And the majority of them are white men, right? And so this red is the representation in public office, and the blue is actually the percent of the U.S. population. So as you can see, generally speaking, we like to see equality in terms of the actual number of people in the population, and then the percent of office holders, right? So these should be closer, right? These should be closer together. So here you have the overrepresentative parts of the U.S. population, which are white men. And the people that are underrepresented in our democracy are women, right? As you can see here, women make up this much of the population, but only this much of the elected office. Minorities and women of color in particular, right? The lowest. Oops, I'm sorry. So as I said, people of color are very underrepresented. Men of color make up 19% of the population, but only 7% of elected officials. Women of color have it worse. They are also 19% of the population, but hold only 4% of elected office. So we have to ask ourselves, can a democracy be truly representative if this is true, that white men actually have 8 times the political power as women of color? How does this affect legislation that's passed? How do you think that identity plays a role when you're an elected official? It doesn't necessarily always dictate how you'll vote or what sort of legislation you'll propose, but there are some issues here. We do not have all people equally represented. Changing gears slightly, to campaign finance and campaign spending. Before we talk about Citizens United, I wanted to give you some background to make sure we're all on the same page. So this is campaign spending in 3 acts. So financing campaigns, first of all, is very expensive. In 2012, all presidential and congressional candidates, even the unsuccessful ones, party committees, and political action committees, or PACs, spent more than $7 billion on primaries, the general election campaigns, and national conventions. Money and political campaigns go hand in hand, and this has not escaped controversy. There's been several limitations on campaign spending, right? How much a presidential candidate could receive and spend. The first problem that Congress was trying to solve was not the amount that campaigns spent, but the imbalances that were created when some people could afford to contribute more than others. So if more money equals successful elections, that's not really democracy, that's purchasing office, right? Just because you have more money, you shouldn't necessarily win, right? So in 1971, they passed the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that created a system to monitor the flow of funds and also set limits on contributions made by individuals. This is only for presidential campaigns, though, and there's no limits on election expenditures for Congress. It also set up the FEC, right, the Federal Election Commission, which is a 6-member commission that enforces the federal regulations with the contributions and expenditure of campaign funds. So there's also been a rise of political action committees, PACs, right? They actually bypass the prohibitions of unions or corporations or other organizations from contributing directly to candidates for national office. They basically set up voluntary contributions, and it's totally legal as long as they don't coordinate their spending efforts or cooperate with the campaign of the candidate, right? They have to remain separate. This is very, very key. It is totally illegal for the PAC, the Political Action Committee, and the campaign of the candidate to coordinate. They cannot coordinate, they cannot collude, they cannot decide where all the money is going to go. They are totally separate. So campaign funds, just so we are also understanding here, what do they actually cover? It's very expensive, right? So they can cover rental or furnishing of the campaign headquarters, communication, transportation, any sort of polls that they want to do, TV and newspaper ads, political consultants, the staff, right, the actual people that they employ. And mostly for presidential races, all of their campaign spending, all their money goes to media advertising. That's like the majority. Okay. So some concerns that people continue to have even after some of the changes that were made included issues of soft money. And these are contributions that are unrestricted because they're made indirectly to the campaign. For instance, via party building activities like voting registrations or voting drives. So there's some loopholes here that make it sort of easy for this soft money to get around the laws. So to counteract this, Congress passed the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, also known as the BCRA or the McCain-Feingold Act. And what this did was it limited soft money. So there was no more soft money contributions allowed to national political parties. It also increased limits on hard money contributed by individuals. And it also prohibited corporate, union, or trade associations from sponsoring candidate targeted ads just before elections and primaries. Remember how I said that the media plays a huge role in this? We'll come back to this. Another concern is what is called 527 committees, right? A 527 committee is a tax-exempt group that the FEC doesn't regulate. It's called 527, right? It's because it's the section 527 of the tax code, right? So they can basically raise soft money if there is no express support for or against a specific candidate. In 2010, this is our third act, there was a very important ruling. Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This huge ruling in 2010 basically overturned this third bullet, what I have in blue here. As of 2010, corporations and unions could spend freely and support or oppose candidates openly. They could pay for political ads, dump as much money as they want into a political campaign, again, as long as they didn't coordinate their spending with the candidate's campaign. The idea was that limiting expenditures, like limiting money by corporations or unions, the money that they could donate, violated the First Amendment's protection of free speech. The ruling basically said that corporations are people, at least as far as the First Amendment is concerned. So money is construed as speech, right? And we know that the First Amendment, you have the freedom of speech, right? Well, they basically equated corporations with people and money with speech, right? So since we have the right to free speech, corporations have the right to give money to people that they want to elect. So you can spend how you like, right? So corporations can basically spend freely. And there was significant dissent on the Supreme Court. Justice Stevens wrote that a democracy cannot function effectively when its constituent members believe laws are being bought and sold. So now it became all about corruption, right? And how easy it could potentially be. And this opened up the opportunity for people to make what are called super PACs. A super PAC can raise unlimited contributions from corporations or unions or individuals. A regular PAC is set up to represent just one corporation or one interest group, right? A super PAC is established to combine unlimited contributions by people or organizations and then funnels all of this into independent expenditures. They're basically like PACs on crack. Since super PACs do not make contributions to candidates personally, they can accept unlimited money from media and what's called electioneering. And as we know, the majority of the money in campaign goes to media, right? So there's a ton of stuff that happens here, right? A ton of money that gets funneled and a ton of stuff that could potentially happen. So let's think about this. What does unlimited money look like? What did Citizens United allow? Well, what is becoming very clear, since the ruling is that the super rich can basically increase their donations exponentially, we see, especially for the 2016 election, just 158 families have provided nearly half the early money, and some have contributed millions of dollars. And some people say that this gives the super rich the power to steer economic and political directions of the country, which, in many opinions, undermines democracy. Here you have an example, the Koch brothers, right, Charles and David. They're billionaires. They're worth $41 billion each, and they said that they plan to spend close to $900 million on the 2016 campaign. And that would be more than double their 2012 election campaign spending, which was just under 400 million. This is a huge concentration of money, and a lot of it is undisclosed. We actually don't know where it's coming from. So my question is, do you think this influences legislation, right? So we have Ted Cruz, for instance, getting 10 million from an oil billionaire, 11 million from a hedge fund manager, 15 million from two guys from Texas. We have Marco Rubio's super PAC, who collected 12.5 million from just 4 donors. A lot of the money is coming from the finance sector, energy sectors like oil and gas. So again, a rhetorical question here, but how do you think that money is going to affect laws regarding fracking or drilling for oil? Or any sort of laws made on the finance sector, right, and banking? Do we think this influences legislation? So, what does Citizens United look like 5 years later? Maybe this can help you make some format your opinion. Well, outside spending by a tiny number of mega-rich donors has played an increasingly important role in each federal election since the Citizens United ruling in 2010. Outside spending on Senate elections has more than doubled since 2010, since Citizens United, increasing to 486 million in 2014. Outside groups spent more than the actual candidates in 2014's closest races. They were actually outspent completely by outside groups and parties in 8 out of 10 races. Let's see. Super PACs are funded by just a couple of people, the exclusive few. Across all federal elections since Citizens United was decided again in 2010, there has been more than $1 billion in super PAC spending. And again, just a couple of people, just 195 individuals and their spouses gave almost 60% of that money. And what is called dark money has more than doubled, right? This is spending from groups that don't actually fully disclose their donors. So the source of the election spending is hidden, and research shows that voters can't actually evaluate the trustworthiness of the messages they see. So the idea could potentially be that not necessarily the fact that there is money in politics, but that a tiny number of super wealthy people are bankrolling the majority of the spending. What I have here is called the multi-million-dollar megaphones, right? Do you think this could potentially will drown out individual, ordinary voters? What is it about? Some questions. I want you guys to consider some of these questions in your response papers and your discussion posts, right? Watch the video. I linked a 9-minute video in the response paper, I think as well in the discussion posts. And then consider some of these questions. The video gives an even more extensive sort of highlights of Citizens United if this PowerPoint wasn't enough. There's a ton of stuff you could talk about, and I unfortunately don't have the time to go into all the details, but that video is a really good review if you need it. So let's consider some of the consequences of this ruling. What does quid pro quo mean? Do you think this is the case with campaign donations? Is there a quid pro quo situation here? And I can give you a hint. Basically, can money kind of suggest or encourage some legislation or some political offices to go a certain way, etc.? What do you think about the Citizens United ruling? Should corporations have the right of free speech, just like you and I, just like a regular citizen? Does free speech equal money? Would you, if you were on the Supreme Court, would you vote a different way? Things to consider. Again, all of these questions are detailed in your assignment, and I'd like you to consider at least a couple of these in your response papers, and let's talk about them in the discussion posts. So changing gears slightly, let's talk about voting, particularly the Electoral College. Back in the day, the founders of this country were all about representative government, as we know, but they were hesitant to put full power in the hands of the people, especially when it came with the election of the president. So they set up the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is made up of electors, people who cast their votes, and it's equal to the number of senators and representatives that the state has, right? So let's pretend Georgia has 2 senators and 14 members in the House of Representatives. How many electors do they have in the Electoral College? 16, right? You just add them up. 14 plus 2. Let's say Illinois has 18 members in the House of Representatives and 2 members in the Senate. How many do they have total? How many electoral votes do they have? 20, exactly. So when you vote, you technically don't vote directly for the presidential candidate. It's not a popular vote where every single vote goes towards the candidate, one of the candidate or the other. Instead, the majority votes in the state contributes to the electoral votes. A total of 538 votes are cast, and the presidential candidate who has the majority of these wins the elections, right? As you can see here, this is the 2012 electoral vote. Either Romney or Obama needed 270 to win, and as you can see, Obama, of course, did win, right? And the blue corresponds to the states that Obama won, and the red that Romney won. So this is what we'll be seeing for the 2016 elections, or what we have seen for the 2016 elections, depending on when you're watching this video. So there are some potential issues with the Electoral College, and some people who don't actually love it. And one of the issues is that you can win the popular vote, but actually lose the electoral vote. So this is a graph that kind of shows you how that could be the case. So let's pretend each of these boxes are a state, right? Because it's just based on the majority of the vote in each state, it doesn't matter if you win, this many votes or, slightly less, right? You can win 51% of a state, or you could win 98% of a state, and it's the same thing, right? You still win the same amount of electoral votes. So as you can see here, there are still some, so like the blue here, right? You could win, there's 25, let's say 25 people, just to make this simple, to 20 people, right? This is a popular vote, right? If we're counting every single person's vote, the blue candidate would win, right? And this is the electoral vote, right? We're just going to count in each state the majority of the winner, right? So in this case, in this state, the red candidate won. Same thing here, and here the blue candidate won, right? And you would just get one for each of this, right? So within this electoral vote, the red candidate actually wins, right? So let's pretend you're living in a state where the majority of the population is Republican. As a Democrat, you might feel a bit drowned out there. But in a state where it's kind of closer to 50-50, it seems like the vote could actually be a little bit more consequential, right? Because if it's a real contest between one of the two. Right, so I linked a video below that gives you more details on this. I won't include it in the in my PowerPoint here because I don't think it really records very well. But that's a great video. Check it out, and it'll give you some more details about the popular vote versus the electoral vote, which actually did happen in 2000. I just wanted to highlight as well the concept of voter fraud. I think this is really, really important. You hear a lot of clamor, especially from the conservatives, about voter fraud. What is voter fraud? Well, it's this idea that people are faking identification in order to vote, right? Or to vote more than once so that they can help the candidate that they want to win. It could also mean paying someone to vote a certain way, right? All of these things are instances of voter fraud. And sometimes it's actually unintentional too. It could be intentional, unintentional, in the forms of election misconduct or irregularities, technical glitches of voting machines. But I want us to figure out, is voting fraud rare, or do we actually see it in society today, in the American elections? Well, let's look at the bills that are being passed. In reaction to all of this talk about voter fraud, since 2001, nearly 1,000 bills that would tighten voting laws have been introduced in 46 states. 24 voting restrictions have passed in 17 states since 2011, and new laws that could affect almost 5 million voters are going to be affected if these things pass. In the past 2 years, 5 battleground states, Florida, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, have tightened their voting laws. Now, battleground states are the ones that have a closer, 50-50 split to the vote, right? So your vote really does, not that your vote doesn't count in other states, but in this case, the votes are consequential, right? So there's a potential blocking of the vote. There's also a potential discouraging of new voters. Since 2011, 34 states have introduced laws requiring voters to show photo ID. And 9 states have actually passed photo ID laws affecting almost 4 million voters. 2.2 million registered voters didn't vote in 2008 because they didn't have proper ID. Crazily enough, in 2011, 12 states introduced laws requiring birth certificates or other proof of citizenship to vote. 3 actually passed. And if you think about it, only 48% of women actually have a birth certificate with their current legal name on it. The social norm is for women to change their names, right? So those women could not have voted. Texas has a new ID law which permits voters to use concealed handgun licenses as proof of identity, but not state university IDs. So you would assume that that all these laws are being passed or introduced, and people are so worried about voter fraud, it must be a really significant problem, right? Wrong. The truth is, there's actually very, very little evidence of voter fraud. For example, a 2005 report by the American Center for Voting Rights claimed that there were more than 100 cases of voting fraud involving 300,000 votes in 2004. And then a review of those charges turned up only 185 votes that were even potentially fraudulent, right? So you have, out of 300,000 votes, 185 cases of just potentially fraudulent votes. That's less than 1%. In support of a voter ID law, you have Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobash citing 221 incidents of voter fraud in the state between 1997 and 2010. But those cases only produced 7 convictions, and none actually relating to impersonating other voters. Indiana was defending its photo ID law before the Supreme Court, and it was actually completely unable to cite a single instance of voter impersonation in the entire history of Indiana as a state. Last December, actually this was a couple years ago, in December, Republican National Committee Chairman Reince Priebus declared that Wisconsin is, quote, absolutely riddled with voter fraud, end quote. In fact, the state's voter fraud rate in 2004 was 0.0002%. That's just 7 votes. There was a great study done by the Washington Post, the most recent. From 2000 to 2014, there were 31 incidents of potential voter fraud. And within this period, more than $1 billion with a B ballots were cast. So that's not a whole lot. In other cases, some votes that were called fraudulent were actually found to be mistakes. A son had the same name as a deceased father. The social security of a dead person was mistakenly matched with a living voter. And they found that some errors were just the result of a too sensitive scanner or other clerical errors. So voting fraud rarely happens, but millions of people are actually kept from voting. By the way, I'm also linking a video about voting laws. John Oliver, who is awesome and really funny, can also give you a great introduction to the issues there and the numbers. So I'll link that below as well. So like I said, millions of people are being barred, right? And again, this is realizing that voter fraud is rare. As you can see from this graph, let's compare these two. On the left side here, we see that 649 million votes were cast in general elections between 2000 and 2010, right? So 10 years, 649 million votes. Within that time period, there are 32,299 reports of UFOs. 352 people are caused by, their deaths are caused by lightning. And there are only 9 possible occurrences of voter impersonation. So you see, it is far more likely to even see a UFO than to have voter fraud. Now, looking at the chart on the right, who are the majority of people who don't have a valid photo ID and thus cannot vote in dozens of states? 25% of voting age citizens without valid photo IDs are Black Americans, 20% are Asian Americans, 19% are Hispanics, 18% are young people 18 to 24, and seniors 18%. 15% of voting age citizens without valid photo IDs are low-income people. Does this bring up any memories of Chapter 5, the Civil Rights Movement, or the voting barriers against people of color, like the poll tax? As you can see, these laws specifically target people of color. So there's very little evidence of voter fraud, and yet voter ID laws are being passed. And you might think, oh, come on, it's just an ID. How hard could it be to get one of those? Well, it's not always easy or straightforward to get an ID. What are some of these issues? Well, if you are disabled and unable to get around, it's pretty difficult to get to a DMV or whatever, like a local bureaucratic office. What if you're too poor to pay the fee? In a lot of places, state-issued driver's license or IDs are like, dozens of, $80, $90, $100. That's a lot. If you are living check to check, you really don't have the money to splurge at that point on an ID. I don't know if you guys have been to the DMV or some of these local offices, but a lot of times they're open like 9 to 5. And if you work, right, or are unable to get off of work, that's really difficult, right? And as you can, I'm sure everyone has been to one of these at least once, there's a lot of time that is spent in these facilities. Or what if you've moved or been in some sort of natural disaster or whatever, and you no longer have your original documents, like a birth certificate, right? But you do see poor people generally having a really hard time getting an ID because they have a really hard time getting off of work, and they have a really hard time paying the fees that are sometimes really high. And of course, those vary state to state, right? I know in Florida they're pretty high. So they're pretty difficult, right? So who are the disproportionately poor in this country? It's people of color, right? We've already learned that in Chapter 5. So as you can see here, the majority of people who had the wrong IDs and who had issues in voting registration were overwhelmingly people of color, right? White people only made up 8% of those who had the wrong IDs, and Black people are 3 times that amount at 24%. You have Latinos at 28%, Asians with an overwhelming 78%. And these numbers hold for registration problems, right? We have whites with some problems, right? 17%, but over double are black people, Latinos, Asians, right? So voting is very important. It's what characterizes a democracy, and it should be available to all people, regardless of color, gender, ability, or geography, right? So something to consider, right? We need to sort of understand the history of where a lot of these things come from and the social ramifications of laws, right? We don't live in a vacuum. We live in a society that has structural inequalities, especially for people of color, for people that are poor. And I think it's really important to remember that. So I'll leave you here, and I'll see you next chapter. As always, any questions, please don't hesitate.